quality of Steven Universe Future has always been controversial, there are a few episodes from the season that are nearly universally beloved, and no episode is as critically acclaimed as episode 16, Fragments, and it's not hard to understand why. It's an episode that has great jokes, one of the best fights in the series, and one of the most interesting deep dives into Steven's psyche, and that's what we're talking about today. In this video, we're going to continue our journey through the Steven Gets Bad Advice trilogy, and discuss how, after a series worth of pacifism and through some of the best animated sequences in the franchise, Jasper finally gets Steven to snap.
What you're saying is, you're here for a rematch!
As I talked about in my last Steven Universe video, Steven's road trip with his dad ends with the van crashed and our protagonist cutting ties with his human side, and this feeling in Steven continues into Fragments, with the episode opening to Greg and Bismuth fixing his mistake, and Steven watching emotionless from afar. This scene is super short, but it does foreshadow something that this episode's ending will hit pretty heavily, being the idea that Steven's mistakes always manage to be fixed, and he never really has to face any long-term consequences. More on that later though, and back to the beginning of the episode. Just like how Mr. Universe characterized Greg's parenting style as well-intended but somewhat problematic, this first scene does the same with the 3 crystal gems, as they push Steven to the point of first, literally and figuratively putting up walls, and second, to end up fleeing the house altogether. Going from least bad to Pearl, Amethyst's attempts during the scene to calm Steven down are actually pretty solid on the surface. While telling him to quote, "just chill man," does sound a little bit off in a vacuum, she does seem to genuinely want to know what's plaguing Steven for his sake. It's hardest to blame Amethyst out of everybody in this scene, as besides having the least amount of lines before Steven bails, as everybody else keeps interrupting her, she's also just not in a position to help him, as she's clearly the least parenty to Steven of any of the crystal gems. Next up is Garnet, whose tough love approach is on full display in this scene, and to pretty poor results. It's a bit strange to see the usually stoic Garnet fail so utterly in this scene to grasp what Steven actually needs, and while I'm sure that many fans will see this as yet another example of character derailment in future or whatever, I think it's more indicative of how strange of a situation this is for the crystal gems, as while Steven did come to them with problems throughout the original series, they were always fairly simple things that could be solved with a story or a trivial circumstance in 11 minutes, and never a situation as complicated as Steven's whole way of life being built around helping people, and now in a seemingly peaceful future, he doesn't know what to do with himself. Take this line from Garnet, for example.
What's going on?
It looks like Steven is trying to avoid a serious discussion about this altogether.
She interrupts Amethyst, asking him to calm down in order to yell this at Steven, a statement that, while entirely true, is also entirely unhelpful, and only serves to further build conflict between Steven and the other 3, as he feels less and less part of the team. And as I alluded to before, the grand prize for the worst approach to Steven's mental breakdown, at least before Jasper, obviously goes to Pearl. This isn't supposed to be a character assassination on Pearl, as throughout Steven's life, she's arguably the best parental figure he's ever had, and is probably the only reason he's not dead, or at least more messed up. But that's also not to say that her actions throughout this episode aren't in character, because they certainly are. Pearl's main focus when essentially yelling at Steven is what he's doing to other people, first blaming him for almost killing Greg, and then telling him that he needs to calm down before anybody else gets hurt, as if he wasn't already hurt himself. Though it really destroys any chance of Steven coming out better through this interaction is the overwhelming nature of all 3 gems coming at him at once, and talking over each other, with each gem getting louder and louder in order to be the one that Steven hears, which results in them all essentially screaming by the end. All of this results in Steven accidentally speeding up as a way to disassociate and running away to be alone. Or at least, that's what Steven tells Jasper, but as she points out, he's done a pretty poor job trying to be alone. And while he does give the excuse of this being the last place anyone will ever look for him, the truth is far more likely to be that Steven has rarely ever been alone in his entire life, and thus doesn't really know how to do it. Something he doesn't fully learn until the end of Future, and something that becomes more evident as he runs after Jasper after she leaves him so he can actually be alone. The scene that follows as Steven and Jasper walk through the forest that she's destroyed is absolutely visually stunning, but also fully reveals the parallels between Jasper and Steven that makes him ultimately susceptible to her teachings of violence, best seen through this line.
I've got nowhere to go, no one to serve. All I have left is power!
Jasper's outbursts are a result of her no longer being able to channel her energy towards the war, just like Steven. Him seeing Jasper's violent outbursts seemingly help her is obviously very appealing to Steven, and after agreeing to a future rematch, Jasper agrees to help Steven, quote, control his power. 3 days of which are condensed to be the final montage of the series, and man is it fantastic. Before fully diving into that though, I do want to quickly appreciate the comedy of this episode, something that I feel sometimes get lost when I make these analysis videos. But this episode handles humor really well for telling this kind of story. All jokes are kept to the first 7 or so minutes before things get really serious, and the focus is always still on the characters, with Jasper's side comments about how hard it is to find good rocks, and the Looney Tune-esque nature of parts of the montage being nice compliments to the overall episode. In general, Jasper just has a collection of great lines throughout this episode, which helps in making it easier than ever to somewhat sympathize with her.
I didn't teach you that.
Back to the montage, there's so many details to focus on as the Steven that we've watched for so long is slowly eroded. When Steven first begins to use his powers in this episode, him using them to attack feels awkward, as they're obviously more defensive in nature, as the first shield he shoots out just slowly approaches Jasper. But as the scene continues, his attacks become quicker and more natural, and his protective nature shifts into an aggressive one. Other details during this scene indicate the same change, as besides just the obvious of feeling and thus presenting older, he also easily catches, kills, and cooks a fish, something that a younger Steven struggled heavily with emotionally. Steven went into the forest wanting to change himself and become a new person, and Jasper certainly helps him achieve that goal. Despite all of the warning signs, Steven does initially seem happier because of the training that he's done with Jasper, but while releasing his aggression in the form of violent outbursts did initially help, the entirety of Steven's surrounding has been destroyed by his new relationship with Jasper, and soon enough, he's ready to destroy that too. Steven's fight against Jasper at the end of this episode might just be my favorite in the franchise, and while part of that is just how immensely beautiful it is to watch, as the choreography borders on mind-blowing, it's also such a well-done deconstruction of Steven's training with Jasper. After Steven lands his first blow, he immediately recoils in just how unnatural it feels, but his hesitancy is met by Jasper with this headbutt, which feels as brutal as any hit in the show. This conditioning from Jasper continues throughout the fight, as the pair fly through the forest, as she rewards him getting more and more violently aggressive with praise, replicating the feeling he first got when he first let his anger out on a tree. But just like how smashing rocks turned into destroying a forest, and destroying a forest turned into sparring with Jasper, Steven gets lost in the first thing that has brought him some semblance of purpose in quite a while, and the music begins to shift as he traps Jasper, essentially ending the fight, but then he begins to prepare a final attack anyway. The spikes on Steven's barrier as he hovers above Jasper feel so unnatural, as doing this is something that's obviously not in the nature of the Steven of the first 5 seasons, but is something that has been built up to for 16 episodes at this point. Before Steven ultimately unleashes the full extent of the aggression that he's been holding on to, you can see the outline of a diamond in his pupils, as he's become exactly what he spent the entire series trying to prove that he wasn't. At this point, the music cuts as thunder booms throughout the rest of the episode, as Steven runs into his bathroom and reveals what trying to control his aggression has led him to. But while it seems like this episode avoids its most dire possible ending, Steven's shattering of Jasper still messes him up in 2 distinctly devastating ways. First of all, while Steven is obviously happy that he's able to save Jasper, it's yet another reminder of the fact that all of his mistakes end up being solved pretty quickly, and therefore he feels as if he's not having to face any consequences. This idea comes back more directly in a few episodes, but the big sting at the end of Fragments relates back to Steven becoming what he spent 5 seasons telling everybody that he wasn't, as Jasper bows to his strength, recognizing his inability to hold back his immense power as that of a diamond.
My diamond. No.
The word tragedy in this video's title refers to both of the main characters of the episode, so let's focus on the Jasper side of it first. Unlike most of the other characters in this season, Jasper enters it still having some serious issues that a more clear-minded Steven would likely be attempting to address. While she states that her goal throughout this episode is to rematch Steven, it's clear that she's actually trying to attain something else, being something or someone to devote her life to. As I mentioned before, Steven and Jasper are similar in that both of them felt like their purpose was to try and help end the war, and now that the war is over, both of them feel lost and searching for a new goal. Because Jasper was built to overwhelm opponents with her dominant physical strength, it makes sense why, in a peaceful time, she would resort to wanting to not only become stronger, but the strongest. However, in a forest where her only opponents are trees, it makes sense why she would jump on the opportunity to prove to herself that she's still the strongest by rematching Steven, who's pretty clearly established himself as the strongest being on the planet. But when he fairly easily disposes of her according to her own methods and in what she deems to be the cruelest way possible, that being shattering her and then bringing her back just to think about how much weaker she truly is, she recognizes something in Steven that she can grasp onto, being the way of the old diamonds, the diamonds which she devoted her life to serving. Which of course brings us to Steven, as after a series worth of making his own identity, he's ultimately demonstrated diamond levels of abusing power, as he's committed the worst thing he can imagine, and then used his diamond exclusive powers to avoid the consequences of doing such. Towards the end of the series, the way that Steven justified to both himself and others that he wasn't his mother was his ability to end conflicts without violence, something that she could never do. But in this situation, he's done something even worse, bringing violence into a peaceful world, something he associates with the colonization methods of the other three diamonds. And thus, it makes perfect sense that, after this episode, he believes the only people who can truly understand what he's going through are the only people who he knows have done the terrible things he thinks he's capable of, as he books his ticket to Homeworld. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who's watched my stuff recently, especially my last two Steven Universe videos. I know in my last video I seemed a little uncertain in how I wanted to cover Future, but I think I've decided that after Fragments, I want to cover the last episode in the Steven Gets Bad Advice trilogy, Homeworld Bound, and then go back and cover the movie in a video that's almost certainly going to take and be uncomfortably long. And then, hopefully, before the end of the year, talk about the entirety of Future in one video. I know I've covered this season in the most backwards possible way, but I hope you guys still look forward to how all of this shakes out. Fair warning though, these plans could definitely change, so if you want more up-to-date updates regarding what I'm working on, you can find my Twitter somewhere in the description. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with a video on perhaps Adventure Time's most iconic episode. Thanks for watching.